On August 12, 1998, Jean-Michel Basquiat died of an overdose, aged just 27. He would leave behind a body of work and a legacy that would define a generation of art, and nearly 30 years later, Basquiat's untitled skull painting would sell for $110.5 million, securing its position as one of the most expensive pieces of artwork ever sold, and further cementing Basquiat as a pivotal figure in 20th century art. But behind the name, the fame, and the millions of dollars, there was a singular artist working in spaces that few people ever saw. So in today's video, I want to take a step away from the clean gallery walls and take a look inside Basquiat studios, uncovering how these spaces shaped his process and played an essential part in his tragically short but remarkably influential life. From 1979 to 1981, Basquiat lived and worked from a small apartment at 527 East 12th Street with Alexis Adler, his girlfriend at the time. Being his first permanent address since leaving his parents' home, it was a fairly unremarkable space, but played a really important part in his early experiments before his painting work took priority. The writer Jordana Moore said he paints on boxes, briefcases, and old TVs he brings in from the street, as well as the floors, cabinets, and doors of the apartment itself. Because this was the very early stages of Jean-Michel's artistic explorations and career, he didn't have or need to have a separate dedicated studio space, and so his somewhat messy apartment became not only his studio, but the walls, the ceilings, and many of the apartment's contents became objects of art in and of themselves. A friend of Basquiat said that the apartment became a provisional canvas. He sketched, drew, and painted straight onto the walls, or on the white patches of plaster where paint had peeled away. Alexis Adler said that this was a time before Jean had canvases to work with, so he used whatever he could get his hands on. He was constantly creating. The derelict streets of the East Village provided his raw materials, and he would bring his finds up the 6 flights of stairs to incorporate into his art. Basquiat was not only a self-taught artist, but also an avid reader and self-educator, something that heavily influenced and inspired the contents of his paintings, but also the contents of his studios. It was well known that his studio spaces were often a maze of chaos, canvases, and painting materials, but also a large array of art history and science books like Gray's Anatomy, Jansen's History of Art, and books on famous artists like Picasso and Jackson Pollock. He was constantly reading, self-educating, and absorbing new sources of information, and this constant process of self-learning ultimately became directly intertwined with his artwork, with Basquiat taking a huge amount of inspiration from these immediate literary surroundings placed within his studios. I also engaged in quite an extensive and continuous period of self-education when I was trying to become a professional illustrator, but rather than socialising with Andy Warhol and frequently visiting local galleries, I opted for the extremely effective digital online equivalent, Skillshare, which also happens to be the sponsor of today's video. So I wanted to learn how to do editorial illustration essentially as quickly and efficiently as possible while still working a 9-to-5 job, and Skillshare was the perfect platform to make that happen. It has a huge library of all kinds of courses. A standout for me was Mikey Burton's videos on editorial illustration. There was just something extremely useful about seeing a professional work through and complete an entire illustration brief, and then hearing their thoughts and rationale for every stage along the process. And so Skillshare was so effective for me because you're essentially getting one-on-one coaching and years, sometimes decades, of professional design, illustration, film, photography, animation experience, whatever your category of choice is, condensed into short, manageable courses that can be very easily completed in a couple of hours at most. So if you're looking to start working as an artist, or make a career change, or just start learning a completely new skill, consider signing up, because the first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. As Jean-Michel's career started to gain momentum in early 1981, he moved into 68 East 1st Street, but in September of 1981, he's then offered to rent one of his first and most important studio spaces in the basement beneath the Soho Gallery, owned by Anina Nozay. And unlike his apartment at the time, we actually have quite a few really interesting images of this particular studio. And so, as you can see, the space was very bare bones, almost literally, with the concrete floor and unfinished plasterboarded walls. The space was very deficient in many ways, and without any furniture or really anything at all, unsurprisingly of course, given that it was just a basement. Interestingly, the studio had this uniquely large skylight across one wall, which provided a lot of well-needed natural light, but the room itself was mostly empty, aside from the large painting storage rack you can see in the background here, which was probably very useful due to the speed and quantity of work that Basquiat was producing at the time. However, since Basquiat was living elsewhere, he simply didn't need much more in this particular studio, other than his brushes, paints, and a few other basic materials. The space was purely just a platform or a vessel for the unrestricted creative ideas that he was constantly trying to express, rather than serving a more specific functional purpose for his art. And despite all of the disorganised scatterings of brushes and paints, his studio was an extremely productive and effective space. The main reason being that the large size of the studio allowed him to work on multiple large paintings at the same time. Basquiat was the kind of artist to jump around from piece to piece in a constantly sporadic but also very controlled and intentional manner. There was a controlled fluidity to the way that he used his studio spaces, so the larger room literally meant more movement, more ideas, and ultimately more work as the demands for his paintings were significantly increasing. In 1982, Basquiat moved into a new Soho apartment at 151 Crosby Street, which he lives and works from after leaving the gallery basement studio due to a disagreement with Anina Nozay. Because this was his own private living space and not the basement of a high-end art gallery, you can tell in these amazing images from photographer Roland Hagenberg that he very much let loose and really embraced the unrestricted freedom that this kind of space provided him. These images also give us a really good sense of how Basquiat would use the messy contents of the room and the studio itself as points of inspiration, with the television permanently on in the background, music and various books and other items scattered across the floor. Suzanne Mallouk, one of his past girlfriends who was living with Basquiat at the time, said that he would work on several at the same time, and he would have the television on and be taking iconography from the television. He would be looking at books. He would have people over talking. Someone would say something and he'd write it on the canvas. He was filtering everything from reality, and he would just arrange it in a certain way so that it had some sort of meaning. John Seed, a friend of Basquiat's, also described the studio, saying, "The floor was covered with an amazing array of clutter, art history books, cassette tapes, art supplies and clothing. There were also drawings on the floor, many with footprints on them, and art supplies including oil sticks, paintbrushes and rollers." Later that year, in 1982, Basquiat temporarily moved to a new studio space in Venice Beach, California, beneath the home of art dealer Larry Gagosian. He lived and worked here for long stretches at a time between 1982 and 1984, later moving a few doors down to establish his own space. Unfortunately, this is one of the least documented periods of Basquiat's studio life, and so we really only have a handful of photos. But just based on this image alone, and the fact that it was beneath Larry Gagosian's home, we could probably say that the studio was much more well kept, clean, with big white walls, probably lots of natural sunlight. It was a very positive period for Basquiat, who wanted to get away from the busyness and chaos of New York. Fred Hoffman said, "In the removed environment of Venice, he seemed to find security and solitude. Away from New York, this emergent talent was able to get on with his mission with significantly less distraction." There is also a few video clips of Basquiat working in the Los Angeles studio in the Radiant Child documentary, which is available for free online. I'll post a link down below if you want to check it out for yourself, but unfortunately it is still quite difficult to get a sense of the space even with that video footage. Then in 1982, Basquiat moved into his final studio space, 57 Great Jones Street, leased by his then very good friend Andy Warhol. Basquiat would live and work here until his death in 1988. This studio became quite famous and was of course the birthplace of many great works of art, but this private unrestricted freedom that this space provided was also an amplifier for Basquiat's self-destructive behaviours and addictions that ultimately led to his death. So this studio is both a symbol of his creative success, but also a sad reminder of the pressures and vulnerabilities that fame imposed on him. Despite the importance of this space and Basquiat's popularity at the time, unfortunately, again, we don't have many photos of this studio at all. From the few photos that we do have, the space certainly looks very large, and we know that the building itself was recently listed as a 6,600 square foot property. And for context, a tennis court is around 2,800 square feet. The building had a number of floors and a basement, but whatever the layout and the size of the studio was, the contents and the setup were characteristically Basquiat, with increasing amounts of expensive possessions and his somewhat necessary scatterings of disorganization and chaos spread out across the floors, as you can see in these photos. Anthony Hayden Guest, a journalist who visited the studio, said that the floor would always be covered with unstretched canvases in various stages of completion, and Basquiat, with his usual nonchalant art world attitude, would trot messily across them to fetch me a beer or tend to the spaghetti. The place looked light-hearted, with portraits of Elvis and James Dean and a giant birdcage adorned with a rubber bat. In addition to the mountains of half-finished canvases and painting materials, the studio was home to an array of inspiration for Basquiat's work, as we talked about in his previous studios. After one visit, Robert Thompson recalled that he found him in his bedroom seated on a king-size bed, before which blazed a giant television, animate with sci-fi images. Behind the screen, in the tricky distances of a complex room, were a library and more books. So without having many more photos or videos of the studio, it's difficult to say too much more about it. However, we do have quite a few images of the property interior as it stands today, as it was recently listed for commercial rental. The studio was actually recently purchased by the famous actress Angelina Jolie, who turned it into Atelier Jolie, a high fashion clothing store, coffee shop and a sort of community art studio space. And I do think that this is quite a good thing. I'm sure that there are a lot worse uses for the building. Obviously this isn't too important or relevant for this video, but I did think it was quite interesting to see inside and at least get some sense of the space and the layout. As you can probably imagine, there is a huge amount of information about Basquiat, and it was quite an effort to do all of the research and condense it all down. So if you enjoyed the video, consider dropping it a like. It really goes a long way. And if you're curious about where all of my Skillshare learning and education went, feel free to check out my illustration work on Instagram. There's a link down below. And if you want to see more of these kinds of behind the scenes type videos, looking at all kinds of creative work, going into all different kinds of spaces, and maybe you resonate with my passion and interest in this subject, subscribe, because I've got some really cool stuff planned for the future. But until then, thanks for watching.